The storm came in fast that Tuesday, the way all dangerous things do without announcement, without apology. By 6 in the morning, Aspen was buried under 8 inches of fresh powder, and the plows hadn't caught up yet. The town looked like something out of a painting no one had commissioned. Perfect and cold and absolutely still. Daniel Carter didn't notice the beauty. He never did. Not anymore. He noticed the ice under the fresh powder on the front steps. He noticed the way the wind hit from the northwest, which meant it would stay below 20 degrees until noon. He noticed the single set of tire tracks on Elk Run Drive, someone who'd left before 4, probably heading to Denver before the pass closed. He was a man who noticed things. 12 years in naval special warfare had made sure of that. He was also a father. And that morning, like every morning, that mattered more. Part 1. Routine. Daniel was awake at 5:30. He always was. The alarm was set for 6, but his body had stopped listening to clocks sometime during his second deployment, when the difference between sleeping and waking had become a matter of survival rather than preference. Now it was just habit, the kind that didn't have an off switch. Some mornings he tried to imagine what it would feel like to wake up without that reflex, to come out of sleep slowly, ungathered, the way civilians described it, gradual and soft, consciousness assembling itself in its own time. He could not quite manage it. His mind arrived fully formed and already working, like a machine that had never been taught to idle. He lay still for exactly 3 minutes, staring at the ceiling, listening. Wind against the north-facing windows, the furnace cycling on, a creak from upstairs that meant Lily had turned over in her sleep but hadn't woken. He knew her sounds the way he'd once known the sounds of a forward operating base, cataloged, weighted, constantly monitored. He got up without turning on the light. The house on Elk Run Drive was modest for the neighborhood, which in Aspen meant it was still worth more than he was comfortable thinking about. He'd bought it 4 years ago with the last of what the Navy had given him and what remained of Claire's life insurance, which was a sentence he'd never said out loud and never intended to. 3 bedrooms, a small yard, a kitchen that got decent light in the afternoons. It was enough. He'd stopped asking for more than enough. The ground floor had the particular quality of a space that had been organized by someone with military discipline and then slowly softened by someone 12 years old. His running shoes were by the back door, heels aligned. Lily's soccer cleats were underneath the entry bench, in a tangle with a forgotten library book and a purple elastic band, and something he couldn't identify from this distance. He didn't move any of it. He had learned that the small disorder of a child living freely in a space was not chaos. It was evidence. He made coffee on the old drip machine. Lily had given him a French press for his birthday, and he'd tried it exactly once, declared it needlessly complicated, and returned to the machine and stood at the kitchen window watching the snow. It was still falling. The bird feeder in the yard was buried past its base. He made a note to clear it before school drop-off. At 6:40, he heard her on the stairs. The third step from the bottom always complained, and he'd deliberately never fixed it. Dad. Lily appeared in the doorway, still wearing her Broncos sweatshirt. Hair a wreck. 1 sock missing. She was 12 now. And sometimes that fact still blindsided him, the way she'd crossed some invisible threshold from child to something more complicated without his having been properly notified. "There's a sock crisis," he said. She looked down at her foot. "It'll turn up. It's been 3 days, Lily. I'm playing the long game." She dropped into the chair across from him and pulled her knees up. "Is it still snowing?" "Since midnight." She looked out the window with an expression that was purely pragmatic. "School's going to cancel." "They haven't yet." "They will." She said it with the calm confidence of someone who had access to information he didn't, which, as it happened, she often did. She had her mother's ability to read a situation and arrive at its conclusion about 3 steps ahead of everyone else in the room. Claire had called it intuition. Daniel called it pattern recognition. They had argued about the distinction, amicably, many times. He poured her a glass of orange juice and set it on the table. She wrapped both hands around it like it was something warmer. He didn't think about Claire every morning. He thought about her most mornings. There was a difference, and it had taken him 4 years to understand it. Grief wasn't a flood anymore. It was more like the snow. It could cover everything if you let it. Or you could just keep clearing it, a little at a time. And keep the path open. He kept the path open. He watched Lily pour juice that was slightly too much for the glass, and correct for it at the last second, the same precise adjustment, every morning, and understood again that the best of Claire was not lost. It had just changed address. "I'm going to the cafe," he said. "You'll be okay for an hour?" Lily gave him the look. The 12-year-old look that communicated an entire essay's worth of feelings about being asked that question. "Right," he said. "I'll be back by 8. His phone buzzed while he was lacing his boots. He checked it without thinking 4 years of civilian life, and he still treated every notification like potential intelligence. It was from Ethan Hayes. Ethan had been military police before he'd moved to Pitkin County Sheriff's Department. And before that, he'd been the kind of friend who showed up when you called him and didn't ask too many questions. They played poker together on the second Friday of every month and rarely talked about anything that mattered. The message was short. It said, "Someone was asking around about you. Denver. Could be nothing. Watch yourself today." Daniel read it twice. Then he put the phone in his jacket pocket and finished lacing his boots. He didn't respond immediately. Ethan didn't need a response. He'd sent the message, which meant he'd done his part. The watching yourself part was Daniel's responsibility. He stood up and looked around the kitchen with the kind of systematic attention he usually reserved for new environments. Entry points, sight lines, the window above the sink, which didn't lock properly and which he'd been meaning to fix. He'd known the name that went with this kind of attention for a long time, even before Ethan's message confirmed it. Marcus Voss. He hadn't said it aloud in 2 years. Names like that had weight, and he'd learned that keeping them unspoken helped keep them at a distance. Marcus Voss was the younger brother of Corporal Damon Voss, who had died in Helmand Province in 2017 during a nighttime extraction that went wrong in ways that still showed up in Daniel's sleep occasionally, uninvited. The official inquiry had cleared the team. The facts had cleared the team. Daniel had gone over every decision he'd made that night more times than he could count. The IED had been buried in a culvert that the advance team had cleared 3 hours earlier. Not the team's fault. Not anyone's fault in the clean, assignable way that the bereaved needed fault to be. But Damon Voss had been walking point, and Daniel had been the senior operator on the ground, and the calculus of grief didn't always follow the same logic as official inquiries. Daniel understood this. He had never been able to resent Marcus for it, which was not the same as believing Marcus was right. None of that had mattered to Marcus. He texted Ethan back. "Understood. Let me know if more comes in." Then he pulled on his jacket, called upstairs that he was leaving, heard Lily respond from behind her bedroom door, and stepped out into the cold. The snow was still falling. He paused on the front steps and looked up and down Elk Run Drive. A delivery truck 2 blocks north, working its way through slowly. A dog walker across the street, bundled to the ears. Nothing else. He walked to the cafe. It was 6 blocks. He knew each one with the specificity of a man who had been mapping his environment out of habit for over a decade. The gap between the Henderson's fence and the next property where a vehicle could idle unseen. The single dead street lamp on the corner of Durant and Original that created a blind spot at night. The loading dock behind the gear shop that faced the cafe entrance from an angle. He cataloged them not because he expected to need them, but because the habit of not knowing was one he decided not to cultivate. It was a minor cost. The alternative was more expensive. The town was quiet in the way that only happens when snow has been falling long enough to muffle everything. No traffic, no voices, just the soft crunch of his own boots and the faint sound of a plow working somewhere north of downtown. The air had that particular winter clarity that made everything look closer than it was, outlines sharp against the gray-white sky. The Snowfall Cafe sat on Durant Avenue between a gear shop and a bookstore that survived on stubbornness and tourist foot traffic. It had 16 tables, mismatched chairs, and a wood-burning fireplace in the back corner that the owner, a retired ski instructor named Pete Briggs, kept going from October through April regardless of what the weather was actually doing. The coffee was good. The pie was better. Daniel had been coming here since the week he'd arrived in Aspen. He pushed through the door at 7:15, and the warmth hit him like something physical. Coffee and wood smoke and the faint smell of cinnamon from whatever Briggs had in the oven. The windows were frosted at the edges, and outside the snow fell in long diagonal lines. In here, everything was amber and slow. About half the tables were occupied. The usual morning crowd. 2 women in athletic wear with laptops. An older man, reading a paper copy of the Post. A young couple sharing a pastry in the kind of comfortable silence that meant they'd been together long enough that silence was okay. Daniel ordered his coffee from the counter black, 16-ounce, and took his usual spot near the wall, 2 tables from the fireplace, with a clear sightline to the door. He'd been sitting there for about 10 minutes when Emma Caldwell came in. He didn't know her name yet. He knew her the way you know regulars at a place you go to regularly by pattern and posture rather than by name. She was in her mid-30s, brown hair usually pulled back, always alone, always, with a laptop bag slung across the back of her wheelchair. She had strong hands and a quality of focused attention that reminded him, oddly, of people he'd served with, not soldiers, but the analysts and interpreters who processed the information soldiers brought back, who had the ability to hold a lot of complexity without visibly distorting under its weight. She came in Tuesdays and Thursdays, usually ordered a cortado and whatever the day's scone was, and worked with the kind of concentrated efficiency that kept people from interrupting her. She tipped well. She never lingered after she'd finished what she came to do. She always positioned her chair so that she had a clear view of both the door and the rest of the room, which was probably just practical, given the logistics of navigation, or maybe it wasn't only that. Today she maneuvered through the door with practiced ease, shaking snow from her shoulders. The accessible table in the corner near the window was her usual, and it was open. She headed for it. They didn't speak. They'd never spoken. There was a certain unspoken agreement between regulars at a place like this. You recognized each other's presence and respected each other's solitude. It was, Daniel had always thought, one of the more civilized human arrangements. He turned back to his coffee and the window. He had 20 minutes before he needed to head back for Lily. He sat with the coffee and watched the snow, and let his mind do what it did when he gave it enough quiet. It organized. It filed. It ran through the morning Ethan's text, Lily at the table. The walk here, and separated the relevant from the background noise. The worry about Marcus Voss was low level, a hum rather than an alarm. He'd had low-level hums before. Most of them turned into nothing. Most of them, he was trying to decide whether to get a second coffee when the door opened again and everything changed. 3 of them came in. Daniel registered it without looking up directly. Peripheral vision. Sound. The way the temperature of the room shifted. The man in front was big, not in the soft way of someone who lifted weights for aesthetics, but in the dense, settled way of someone who'd been built by something less voluntary. Early 40s, close-cropped hair going gray at the temples, a scar along the left side of his jaw that hadn't healed cleanly. He wore a dark canvas jacket and moved with the particular looseness of someone who had nothing to be careful about. The 2 men behind him were younger. Followers, not thinkers. Daniel filed this. He didn't look at the man's face. Not yet. He watched the man's hands and his eyes, which told you more. The hands were loose at his sides, which meant he wasn't wound up yet but was ready to be. The eyes went around the room in a sweep that was too practiced to be casual. He was assessing exits and occupants. That was training, or something that had substituted for training. The 3 of them didn't go to the counter. They stood just inside the door, and the big man's eyes moved across the room and landed on Emma Caldwell. Daniel watched him walk toward her. "That's our table." The voice was flat. Not loud, he didn't need volume. He stood over her with his hands still loose, and his 2 companions flanking slightly, which was either habit or intention. Emma looked up from her laptop with the measured quality of someone who was choosing her response carefully. "There are 12 other open tables," she said. "I said that's our table." The room had gone quiet in the particular way that rooms go quiet when something has tipped past the possibility of being ignored. The 2 women with laptops had stopped typing. The man with the newspaper was very still. Behind the counter, Pete Briggs had his hand near the phone. Emma held the man's gaze. "I'll be here another hour. You can have it then." It happened quickly. His hand came off the table edge and caught the edge of her coffee cup, and the cup went over, and the coffee spread across her laptop keyboard in a brown wave. Hey, Emma's voice was sharp. Oops. He didn't move back. Accidents happen. Daniel had already set down his cup. He didn't cross the room quickly. Quick drew attention and raised stakes. He moved at the pace of someone going to help clean up a spill, which was more or less what it looked like from the outside. He was at the table before anyone had fully processed that he'd left his own. He stopped at a distance that was inside the zone where you had to deal with him, but outside the zone where he was in anyone's reach. He'd done enough of this to understand the geometry. Too far, and he was just a voice. Too close, and it became a negotiation of bodies before words, which changed everyone's options. Walk away, he said. His voice was quiet. He'd learned a long time ago that quiet landed harder than loud in most situations. Loud was noise. Quiet was weight. The big man turned. And something happened in his face, a flicker of something that crossed from surprise to recognition in the space of less than a second. Carter. His voice had changed. The flat control was still there, but underneath it something had ignited. Daniel Carter. Daniel met his eyes. He kept his hands loose at his sides. Walk away, he said again. 6 years. The man's jaw had tightened. 6 years I've been looking for you. And you're in a coffee shop. He said it with something that wasn't quite a laugh. You're in a damn coffee shop in Aspen, Colorado, drinking coffee like you don't have blood on your hands. This isn't the place, Daniel said. No? Marcus Voss took a step forward. Where's the place then? Where exactly do we do this? The two flankers shifted. Daniel read it. They were going to move on a signal. And the signal was whatever Marcus did next. He tracked them without taking his eyes off Marcus, which was a skill that took years to build and didn't have a formal name. Damon was 24 years old, Marcus said. His voice had dropped. It was almost intimate. 24 years old, and he trusted you to bring him home. I know how old he was. Then you know what you took. The right flanker moved first, a half step forward, and his hand going toward Daniel's arm. Daniel didn't wait for the grip. He turned into it, caught the wrist, applied pressure to the joint in a way that communicated very clearly what the next step would cost, and the man stopped. The whole thing took approximately 1.5 seconds and resulted in nothing more visible than a slight change in the flanker's posture. Marcus swung. It was a good punch. He wasn't untrained. But Daniel had moved before the swing completed, and the force passed through empty air. What came next was methodical rather than aggressive. Inside the reach, controlling the punching arm, pressure applied to a point just below the shoulder joint that created the kind of pain that produced immediate compliance without damage. Marcus made a sound that wasn't quite a word. Don't, Daniel said. He held him there for exactly long enough to establish the point. Then he released. Marcus stepped back, breathing through his nose. The two flankers had not moved. Daniel looked at them, and they made the correct calculation. Sit down, Daniel said, or leave. Those are your options. He meant it for all three of them. He meant it with every calm and deliberate ounce of 12 years of operational experience, which was sometimes the only language that certain conversations understood. Marcus Voss looked at him for a long moment. Then he turned and walked out, and his companions followed. The door closed. The room was very still. Daniel picked up a stack of napkins from the dispenser on Emma's table and set them beside her laptop. For the keyboard, he said. She looked up at him. Her face was controlled, but her hands, he noticed, were gripping the arms of her wheelchair with more force than was necessary. Thank you, she said. He nodded and went back to his table. He sat down. He finished his coffee. He was careful to do both of those things at exactly the pace he would have done them if nothing had happened, because the room was still watching, and what they saw him do next would set the temperature for the next several minutes, and he wanted that temperature to be, this is over. His phone buzzed. Ethan. He let it go. The patrol car pulled up outside 8 minutes later. Ethan came through the door in plain clothes. He'd been nearby, which meant the text had been more urgent than Daniel had credited it. He sat across from Daniel without being invited. He was broad-shouldered and methodical, and had a face that people tended to trust, which was a useful quality in a sheriff's deputy. He also had the quality, rarer than the first, of knowing when to let a silence sit without filling it. He sat in one now. He looked at the table where the coffee had been spilled. Pete Briggs had cleaned it already, but there was still a faint stain near the edge, and then he looked at Daniel. "The guy with the scar," he said. "Voss," Daniel confirmed. "I know." Ethan's expression didn't change, but something behind it settled into a particular kind of heaviness. "I ran him when I got your text this morning." Before I came over, Ethan let out a long breath through his nose. "He made bail 2 weeks ago, federal. Assault, weapons charges, couple other things. Judge cut him loose pending trial." He looked at the table. "He's been asking about you since Tuesday of last week." "Ethan, I know. You should have told me Tuesday. I didn't have confirmation it was him until this morning." Ethan's jaw tightened. "Believe me. I know. I'm sorry." Daniel didn't press it. There was no point, and Ethan looked like he was already pressing himself about it enough. "The people in here," Daniel said, "they're all witnesses. Nobody touched him. He threw himself into the situation, and he swung first. I'll take statements." Ethan glanced toward the counter, where Pete Briggs was talking to a uniformed officer. "The woman in the chair?" He went for her first. "Spilled her coffee. Deliberate. What's her connection to Voss?" "None that I know of. Wrong table, wrong morning." Ethan was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Daniel. He didn't come here for her. No, he came here for you, which means he knew where you'd be." Daniel had already worked that out. He'd been sitting with it for the last 8 minutes, turning it over. The cafe was not a secret, but it was a routine, and someone had to have established that routine for Voss, either through observation or through information. "I need to pick up Lily," he said. "Go." Ethan stood. "Don't go anywhere else today. I'll come by the house tonight." He paused. "And Daniel?" "He's going to escalate. That's what this was, a first move. He wanted you to see his face." Daniel looked at the window. Outside, the snow was still falling. He went to pick up his daughter. School had, as Lily had predicted, canceled. She was sitting on the kitchen counter when he got home, eating cereal directly from the box and reading something on her school tablet. Feet dangling in mismatched socks. She'd found a second one, purple, which didn't match the green one she was wearing. "You're back early," she said. Cafe wasn't happening. He hung up his jacket. "What are you working on?" "Book report. The Giver." "How is it?" "Dark." She considered the box of cereal. "Also good." Both at once. He made himself a second coffee and leaned against the counter. She talked about the book for a while, and he listened and asked questions, and it was entirely ordinary, which was what he needed it to be. He'd learned this too. The value of ordinary. How it was not nothing. How it was, in fact, the entire point. He fed her lunch. He shoveled the walk a second time. He had her check his work on the bird feeder, which she approved with the gravity of a building inspector. In the afternoon, she wanted to go to the hill behind the development for sledding. And he said yes, and went with her, and they spent an hour doing nothing more dangerous than going down a slope on a piece of plastic, and he monitored every approach to the hill without her seeing him do it. She waved at 2 girls from her class who appeared at the top of the hill. She attempted a run she called the corkscrew, which involved an optimistic lean that sent her into the snowbank at the bottom. She came up laughing, cheeks red, completely dusted in white. He thought, This is what it's for. All of it. Nothing. On the walk back, he checked his phone. Ethan had called twice. He'd call back after Lily was settled. It was at the front door that he noticed the footprints in the snow at the side of the house, single set, coming from the east side of the yard, stopping near the kitchen window, and then retreating the same way. Boot treads, large, recent. The snow had filled them slightly, but not completely. Someone had been close to the house while they were at the hill. He kept his face neutral and said nothing to Lily. He got her inside and settled at the kitchen table with her tablet and her book report. And he walked the perimeter of the house slowly, checking, until he was certain the property was clear. Then he called Ethan. "I've got tracks," he said. "East side, near the kitchen window." While we were out, he kept his voice low and even, standing in the laundry room with the door pulled almost shut. He heard Ethan breathe. "I'm coming over," Ethan said. "Give it an hour. Let Lily get into her routine." He paused. "And Ethan?" This was a message. He wanted me to find them. "Yeah," Ethan said. "I know." The next 48 hours were quiet in the way that a rope goes quiet right before it snaps. Marcus Voss did not appear. He did not approach. He left no further footprints near the house, sent no messages, made no contact, and it was precisely this silence that told Daniel everything he needed to know about the man. He was patient, he was methodical, and he was not interested in a confrontation. Not yet. He was interested in information. Ethan ran the surveillance footage from 2 businesses near the cafe. Voss had been on Durant Avenue at 6:50 in the morning before Daniel had arrived, positioned where he could see the door. He'd been watching for him. That meant he'd established Daniel's routine, which took time, which meant he'd been in Aspen for more than a day before making his approach. "He let you see him," Ethan said, sitting at Daniel's kitchen table with a cup of coffee going cold. He could have picked a different time, somewhere less public. He chose the cafe deliberately. He wanted a reaction. Daniel turned the coffee mug in his hands. He wanted to see how I'd respond under pressure. Whether I'd make mistakes. Did he get what he wanted? Daniel thought about this. "He learned that I don't panic," he said. Which is information. It changes how he'll approach the next step. The next day, Daniel had Lily's soccer practice to manage. A Tuesday afternoon thing. Indoors at the recreation center. The kind of unalterable routine he was now aware Voss probably knew about. He drove a different route. He parked facing out. He sat in the bleachers at the end nearest the door and watched the field and the entrances simultaneously. And let Lily run drills with her team while he worked through the geometry of the situation. The coach, a woman named Darcy, who had run this program for 15 years and had the easy authority of someone whose competence was obvious without being announced, put them through set pieces for the first 40 minutes. Lily was good. Not the best on the team, but she had her mother's spatial awareness, the ability to anticipate where people were going to be 3 seconds before they got there. He watched her cut a pass across 2 defenders who hadn't started moving yet, and the girl who received it had to sprint to catch up, and Lily's expression when the ball landed was the quiet, contained satisfaction of someone who'd calculated correctly and wasn't particularly surprised that she had. He thought, "There it is. That's Claire. Right there." He kept his eyes moving back to the entrance. He spotted the car at 417, a gray pickup, older model, parked across the street from the rec center entrance. The engine was running, the exhaust visible in the cold air. One occupant. When Daniel came out to move to a better vantage point, the truck idled forward a half block and stopped again. Not trying to hide. Testing. Watching to see what Daniel would do. He went back inside. He called Ethan, described the truck and the partial plate he'd caught, and waited while Lily finished practice. She came off the field flushed and talking about a play she'd run in the second half, and he listened with genuine attention because she deserved genuine attention, always, regardless of what else was happening. The truck was gone when they came out. That night, after Lily was in bed, he sat at the kitchen table with a yellow legal pad and worked through what he knew. It was an old habit. The act of writing it out changed something in how the brain processed threat. Made it concrete, made it manageable. He wrote in a shorthand that wouldn't mean much to anyone else. Initials, arrows, times, question marks. He drew the cafe layout from memory. He noted the position of the gray truck at the rec center, estimated the sight line, marked the angle of the shot the photographer had taken through the rec center window. He worked backward from the photograph to the access point, which eliminated 2 walls and suggested the east side parking lot, which had a gap in the perimeter lighting that the county had been meaning to fix for 2 years. He knew about that gap because Lily had told him about it. She'd said the lot was creepy at night, and she didn't like cutting through it after late practice. He underlined the gap in the lighting, added a question mark next to it, and then crossed the question mark out. It wasn't a question anymore. Marcus Voss, age 41, younger brother of Corporal Damon Voss. Kia Helmand Province, 2017, criminal history. Assault with a deadly weapon, illegal firearms possession, suspected involvement in 2 other incidents that hadn't produced charges, 6 years of carrying something that had curdled into this. The problem was not that Marcus was dangerous. Plenty of dangerous people existed and went about their lives without becoming a threat to any specific person. The problem was that Marcus was damaged in the particular way that grief without outlet could damage a person, and he had decided, with the terrible clarity of the obsessed, that Daniel was the cause, and that the cure was something that couldn't be filed or appealed or negotiated. Daniel understood this. He'd watched it happen to men he'd served with. He didn't hate Marcus Voss for it. What he felt, if he was honest with himself, was something closer to pity, the cold, practical kind that didn't require sentiment, the kind that acknowledged another person's damage without assuming any obligation to absorb it. Marcus Voss had chosen this. He'd taken his grief and turned it into a project and let 6 years pass in its service. That was a life. Or what a life became when you handed it entirely to a single fixed idea. Daniel was not going to let that idea include his daughter, but he had a daughter. And that changed everything. It arrived on a Thursday evening, 4 days after the cafe. Daniel was shoveling the walk after dinner when he found the envelope at the base of the mailbox post, half buried in snow, as if it had been placed there rather than delivered. His name was written on the front in block letters. No return address, no stamp. He didn't open it outside. He went in, left his boots at the door, washed his hands, and checked that Lily was upstairs before he opened it at the kitchen table. It was a photograph. Lily at soccer practice. Shot from outside the rec center through the window. The angle suggesting someone at ground level, slightly below the sill. She was mid-run, laughing at something out of frame, completely unaware. The photo was slightly underexposed, which meant it had been taken in the late afternoon. 2 days ago, below the photograph, in the same block print. Now you'll understand what loss feels like. Daniel sat with it for a moment. He was not afraid in the way that fear usually presented. What moved through him was colder and more deliberate than fear. It was the activation of something that had been dormant for 4 years, a mode of attention and calculation that civilian life had no name for, but that he recognized the way he recognized his own heartbeat. He had spent 12 years in environments where the correct response to a threat was not to wait for it to reach you. He called Ethan. He sent him a photo of the envelope and its contents. While he waited, he made himself a glass of water and drank it standing at the sink, looking out the window at the dark yard. He ran through the timeline again. 4 days since the cafe. Voss had had the photograph developed or printed somewhere. There were only 2 places in town that did it, and he'd bet it was neither of them. The image quality and paper stock looked like a home inkjet job, which meant Voss had a printer and a base of operations, which meant he wasn't running a one-man operation out of a motel room. He was set up. That was information. Not good information, but information was always preferable to absence of information. Ethan arrived in 20 minutes. He looked at the photograph for a long time without speaking. He had to have been at the rec center, Daniel said. 2 days ago. He got past the parking lot. I'll pull their camera footage. Ethan slid the photograph into an evidence bag. Daniel, we need to talk about options. I know the options. You can't. I'm not running. He said it without heat. I'm not moving Lily out of her school and her team and the life she's built here because a man in pain has decided I owe him something. I won't do that to her. Ethan looked at him. He'd known Daniel long enough to understand the difference between stubbornness and decision. Then we need to get ahead of him, Ethan said. That's what I've been thinking about. Daniel stood and went to the window. The yard was dark, the snow lit faintly blue by the neighbor's porch light. He'd already checked the perimeter twice since dinner. Upstairs, he could hear Lily moving around in her room, the creak of the desk chair, the low sound of the audiobook she listened to while she did homework. Normal sounds. Safe sounds. He was going to keep them that way. There's something else, he said, still looking out the window. The woman from the cafe. Caldwell. I think she knows more about Voss than she was letting on. He turned. The way she looked when he walked in, she wasn't surprised. She was braced. Ethan frowned. You think they have a prior connection? I think she recognized him before he got to her table, Daniel said. And I think there's a reason she comes to that cafe on Tuesdays and Thursdays. I can run her name. Do that. He looked back at the yard. And call me the minute you have anything. Ethan called at 9:15 the next morning with Emma Caldwell's history, and Daniel listened to it standing in the laundry room, with the door half open, so he could still hear the kitchen where Lily was eating breakfast. Emma Caldwell, 36. Former investigative journalist with the Denver Post, specializing in organized crime and federal prosecution cases. She'd been in Aspen for 14 months, which was about 8 months longer than most people expected when they heard the story of why she'd left Denver. The accident had been in November 2 years ago. Her car had been run off I-70 at a point where the guardrail was, as it turned out, missing a section that should have been repaired. The investigation into whether that missing guardrail section had been deliberately tampered with had produced inconclusive results. Officially, Emma had her own conclusions. The last piece of the federal case she'd been working before the accident had involved a firearms trafficking network operating out of Denver, with connections to several western states. 2 of the men she'd been building toward had federal charges filed in the same 18-month period as Marcus Voss's arrest. She's a witness, Daniel said. Protected status, Ethan confirmed. Which is apparently why she's in Aspen. Low profile. Different name on the lease, which means Voss didn't come here just for me. Daniel was quiet for a moment, working it through. He came for both of us. I was the distraction, or the test. If he could get to me in public, he could establish that he's capable of bypassing whatever arrangements have been made around her. That's a lot of planning for a grief-driven vendetta. He's had 6 years. Daniel turned it over. And maybe the vendetta is real. Maybe it's also useful. He thought about her hands on the armrests. The way she'd said thank you, controlled, contained. The voice of someone who'd been carefully calibrating their reactions for a long time. She needs to know, he said. Daniel. She deserves to know that he found her. Whatever arrangements are in place, they didn't account for this. She needs to be able to make decisions with the right information. He was already putting on his jacket. You have her address? The street where Emma Caldwell lived was 4 blocks from the cafe, in a building with a ramp and a ground floor unit, and a parking spot close enough to the entrance that it was clearly arranged with intention. He knocked at 10:30. She answered in under a minute, which told him she'd heard his car on the street. She looked at him with the same quality of focused assessment she'd had in the cafe. And then she looked past him at the street. And he recognized that too, the reflex of someone who checked exits. You're Carter, she said. Daniel. She held his gaze for a moment. Come in. The apartment was tidy and sparsely furnished in the way of someone who hadn't yet committed to staying, or who'd learned not to accumulate things that were difficult to leave behind. There were 2 laptops on the kitchen table, both open, a corkboard on the wall behind the table, covered in printed documents and handwritten notes connected by string that she'd made no effort to conceal, which meant she'd assessed him as not a threat before she'd opened the door, which was its own kind of telling. He looked at the corkboard without making it obvious that he was looking at it. He caught names he didn't recognize, an organizational chart with boxes connected by dotted lines, a printout of what appeared to be property records. She had a system. The string connecting the documents followed a logic he couldn't decode in a single glance, but that was clearly not random. This was the work of someone who had been building something for a long time. You talked to the sheriff's deputy, she said. It wasn't a question. Ethan Hayes, yes. Daniel sat where she indicated, a chair across from the table. He told me enough. I'm not here to compromise whatever arrangement you have. Then what are you here for? To tell you that Voss was at my daughter's soccer practice 2 days ago, he said. And that, whatever he's planning, he's not separating his reasons. He has a grievance with me, and a threat calculation about you, and they're connected. Emma was quiet. She looked at the corkboard. He found me faster than I thought he would, she said finally. He's been operational for at least a week. Probably longer. Daniel leaned forward slightly. I'm going to end this. Not run from it. I want to know what you know about his network here, who he's using, where he might be set up. She looked at him for a long time. He let her. Then she said, I know where he stayed last winter. Before his arrest, there's a property north of town private, owned by a shell company I traced 2 years ago. If he's back in Aspen, it's the most logical base. She gave him the address. He wrote it down and didn't need to. I'm going to be more careful, she said as he stood to leave. The way she said it wasn't a reassurance directed at him, it was something she was telling herself. So am I, he said. He left her there with her corkboard and her 2 open laptops, and the particular kind of alertness that he recognized because he wore it too. The alertness of someone who had stopped expecting safety as a default and had started building it themselves, piece by piece, with whatever was available. He stood outside his house at 11 that night, in the dark, in the cold, and did not go in immediately. Lily was asleep. Ethan had done a drive-by at 10 and confirmed the street was clear. The envelope and the photograph were with the sheriff's department, and the property north of town would have 2 deputies watching it by morning. These were the facts of the situation. And they were not yet resolved. But they were contained. And containment was not the same as safety, but it was a step toward it. He stood in the snow and thought about Damon Voss, who had been 24 years old and had trusted him and had not made it home. He thought about this without deflection, without the mental shortcuts he sometimes used when the memory pressed too close. He had made the best decisions he could with the information available in the time he'd had to make them. He also knew that this would never be a satisfying conclusion for Marcus, because grief did not recognize the difference between avoidable and unavoidable. He understood it. He had carried his own version of it. He knew exactly what it weighed. He thought about the night he'd come home from the inquiry, 2 years after Claire had died, and Lily had been 10 and she'd been at the neighbors while he drove to Denver and back in a single day. And when he'd come through the door, she'd looked at his face and said, without preamble, Dad, are you okay? And he'd said yes, and she'd said, you don't have to say yes. And she'd been 10 years old, and it had been the most devastating thing anyone had said to him in years. He'd sat down on the kitchen floor right there in his jacket, and she'd sat next to him, and they'd stayed like that for a while, not talking, just present. He'd made his peace with Helmand as much as peace was possible. What he hadn't made peace with was the idea that the consequences of that night could reach forward through 6 years and touch his daughter. He thought about the photograph. Lily mid-stride, laughing, completely herself, completely unaware she was being watched. There was something in the image, something the person who took it had probably not intended to communicate, that was pure and specific and irreplaceable. The world contained people like Lily, and it also contained people like Marcus Voss. And the distance between those 2 facts was the entire argument for what he was going to do next. That he would not allow. The question of what came next, how Voss moved, how quickly, whether the property north of town was the right thread to pull, was a question for tomorrow, and he'd learned in 12 years of operational work that the discipline of not solving tomorrow's problems tonight was not passivity. It was the correct allocation of resources. Tonight, he needed to sleep. He looked up at Lily's window. The light was off. He listened and heard nothing but wind and the faint sound of the neighbor's wind chime. He thought about Emma Caldwell at her kitchen table, with her corkboard and her careful eyes and her 2 open laptops, building the same kind of contained, methodical case she'd apparently been building since before she'd ended up in a wheelchair on a mountain road in November. There was something he recognized in how she'd assessed him, how she'd decided, how she'd spoken without ornamentation. She had the quality of someone who had decided, at some specific point, to stop being frightened of what was frightening her and start understanding it instead. He knew something about that particular transition. He'd think about that at a different time. Right now he had enough on the immediate ledger. He thought about Claire, briefly and without pain, just the fact of her, the specific weight of that particular absence, which after 6 years had a shape he recognized and could carry. He looked at the yard. The snow was clean. He'd shoveled the walk before dinner, and it had filled in a little since, but not much. The bird feeder was visible now. The weight of the fresh powder on its roof. He went inside. The cold had gotten into his collar and his fingers. He registered this the way he registered most physical discomfort, as information, not complaint. Temperature, dropping. Time, late. Priorities, in order. He checked the locks. He checked the window above the sink. He stood in the hallway at the bottom of the stairs and listened for exactly 30 seconds to the sound of his daughter breathing in the room above. Then he went to the kitchen, set his coffee cup in the dish rack, and turned out the light. Outside, the snow kept falling. It had been falling all day. It would probably fall all night. By morning, the town would be under another 6 inches, and the plows would be out again, and Lily would look out the window and make some calm, accurate prediction about school that would turn out to be exactly right. He was not done. This wasn't over. But tonight the path was clear. And tomorrow he'd clear it again. And the night after that if he needed to. As many times as it took. He'd made a promise once to a small girl, with mismatched socks and her mother's eyes, not aloud, not in words, just the fact of staying, which was sometimes the most important promise a person could make. He intended to keep it. He stood there another minute, because sometimes the discipline of standing still in the cold and looking at what you were protecting was the most important thing you could do. Not strategy, not planning, just presence, just the weight of the fact that this was his. And he was here. And he was not going to let it be taken.